Well, we'll roll again. Now, after those introductory comments, we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of the subject. It's an interesting thing. When good things happen, in this world talks about good luck. If something bad happens, particularly a natural disaster, people talk about an act of God. All of a sudden, a belief in God seems to come to the fore. Strange, isn't it? Very characteristically human that that's the way we think. But a bit cynical too. So there seems to be a general anger in the heart of humanity against the God many claim they don't believe in, which sort of gives the game away a bit, doesn't it? I'm going to make a cheeky comment now. I'm going to talk about several things. The first is some common sense statements about the cause of suffering. Well, that's a bit cheeky, but we'll see if you agree that they're sort of common sense. Then I'm going to talk about avoidable suffering. Then direct judgments as a form of suffering. Do you recognise such things? And then I'm going to talk about what was the fourth? I'm just giving you a little bit of warning so that you know. Yeah, suffering as an attack is the last category of these four. So that sort of splits them up, and it may be artificial, but I think it fits. Now, firstly, common sense statements on the cause of suffering. First thing I'd say is that the greatest suffering is probably not physical. That's my belief after watching patients for decades. Often the greatest suffering is in a relative watching a loved one with a serious illness, not the patient themselves. And often it's relatives who come up with these strange suggestions. You mustn't tell Aunt Maggie that it's a cancer. Now, why not tell Aunt Maggie the truth? I used to think about that. I think they don't want me to tell her so that they don't have to face this when they're talking to Aunt Maggie. It's to protect them. That's not a very good reason for telling a lie, is it? So I didn't always believe that. In fact, mostly I didn't believe that. Anxiety is often a bigger form of suffering. Anxiety and guilt cripples more than a physical handicap. We got a boy in our church who's got no arms. They were ripped off when he was 2. Do you think that stops him doing anything? Mm-hmm. He's a brilliant skier. He operates power tools with his feet. He's married with several children. There's no problem. I think it's funny. I understand he stopped to pick up a hitchhiker on one occasion, and the hitchhiker got in. There he was, changes gears, and off he goes with his feet. And I think the hitchhiker was terrified and looking for a way to get out of the car, but he was perfectly safe. On an ABC talkback one morning, I heard someone who'd studied a series of very successful people in their field say that in their investigation of these people, whether the field was competitive sport or more intellectual pursuits, in virtually every case, the individual had had a major setback to overcome. This was people who got to the top of their field. It was a rule rather than exception that they'd overcome some huge problem. Isn't that interesting? Second, the majority of suffering we see in the world is man-made. Now, that may seem self-evident to you, or it may not. Lewis again points out that racks, whips, prisons, slavery, guns, bayonets and bombs are produced by men. Mankind, perhaps, if you want that generic term. And we could extend the list with murder and other violent crimes, all wars, poorhouses and their equivalents, oppression of the powerless groups and minorities in many countries. It's human activity. it accounts for a lot of suffering. Man's inhumanity to man. History is full of examples, as is every daily paper in every country of the world, if you need proof. A friend of mine who is an old retired GP but a delightful thinking man says, the main causes of suffering are ignorance, arrogance, cupidity and stupidity. I think that's pretty good. Covers a lot. Third, many people in the world currently are without sufficient food. Now we know that. We constantly see the requests for food for those starving to death. Been clear for years that there's been enough food in the world for all. The problem is distribution. So it's the way human beings distribute it, which is the problem. And of course there are many good reasons, things like market forces which control this sort of thing. But it's not good. It's a sign of the human heart, is it not? I think it was Mahatma Gandhi who said the world has enough food for its need, but not enough for its greed. It's a good way of making the point. Fourth, economists in many countries claim that the current world global crisis is due to greed in places of great influence, especially the stock markets of the world's richest countries, beginning with the USA. In addition, the poor regulatory laws regarding the borrowing of money in that country was regarded as a big factor in the crisis. You know, loaning money to people who could never pay it back, but don't worry about it because inflation will increase the value of the house and we'll take the house and everybody's happy. Only one thing went wrong. Inflation let them down. It didn't keep inflating. So, crazy. I couldn't borrow money unless the mortgage was going to be only a quarter of my income. Otherwise, I wasn't allowed to borrow money. So there you go. So if you like, human beings have caused this suffering, if indeed it is suffering, and of course to many it is. But someone has said, yeah, but there's something good about it. They've been disillusioned about something they trusted in. And I commented on that before. And there's a good saying, it's good to be disillusioned, because who wants to live with your illusions? And it is true. We've been told by a great teacher not to save our treasure on earth where various forms of attack come upon it. We could now read inflation and collapse of the stock markets into the looking after our treasures. There's a better place to store it and a better treasure to store, said Jesus in his great sermon. So, yes, many people are learning that lesson perhaps the hard way. So there's a few common sense statements, and we won't enlarge on them. We'll go and talk about avoidable suffering. Now this differs from the self-evident examples in that it's perhaps not so obvious. So how do you avoid suffering? How is it sometimes quite avoidable? Well, we could use the example of God's promise to the Hebrews. He said many of the illnesses and sufferings that overtook them were directly following the consequences of disobeying of his instructions. You remember he said to them at one stage, Exodus 15, if you will diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord your God and do that which is right in his eyes and give heed to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases upon you which I put upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. And you remember they were brought out of slavery from Egypt. So some 45 years ago, there was a book written by a physician, Dr. Macmillan, MD, so he's obviously American. None of these diseases, a quote from that statement I just made. It's a bit dated now, not, I would say, reliable as a medical text, but his arguments are still reasonable, and he points out that essentially obedience was good for their health and their well-being. Hence, in that regard, obedience is a good prophylaxis, which I was told was the aim of modern medicine, prevention. So, there are many examples of such avoidable problems in his book. Leprosy was common in those days, and the contagion could be avoided by quarantine rules given by God to Moses. They were nomadic people, you remember? Water was scarce, so personal hygiene made a lot of sense. We would say, in retrospect, made good medical sense, but that's retrospective. At the time, they were given their laws because it was about the holy God and about ritual cleanness in his presence. It wasn't overtly medical, but some of it was pretty sensible. Here's a good example. Deuteronomy 23:12. And you would say, well, what's strange about this? 23:12, you shall have a place outside the camp, and you shall go out to it, and you shall have a stick with your weapons. And when you sit down outside, you will dig a hole with it and turn back and cover up your excrement, because the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to save you and to give up your enemies before you, your enemies. Therefore your camp must be holy, that he may not see things indecent among you and turn away from you. So you see, it was, again, if you like, to do with what they did in the presence of their God. But it's very good. Personal hygiene and public medicine, we'd say common sense, but it hasn't always been common sense to all human beings. And of course they had many rules about cleanness. A dead body, anyone who touched a dead body would then have to be quarantined as unclean for a week. And on the third day and the seventh day they'd wash in running water. And they didn't know about sepsis, they didn't know about infection by organisms. That took thousands of years to discover. But it was very effective retrospectively, and if they obeyed their rules, they avoided many diseases. There were the animals that they had to avoid. You remember the swine, the carrion birds, the shellfish, you know, the bottom dwellers, and you know what they can carry, hepatitis A, etc. The swine carried hydatid, and so on. Well, we can see that with a retrospectoscope with an interest in medicine, but none of that was part of the scene. But 3,000 years later, a man called Semmelweis pointed out the danger of infection in puerperal fever, where the young mothers who had given birth to babies were dying in great numbers because the medical students and the doctors were coming straight from the autopsy room and examining them without washing their hands. Unthinkable to us now, but they thought that was normal. And he demonstrated that if they washed their hands, the rate of infection dropped precipitously. And he was laughed out of the hospital. Eventually his friend wouldn't even talk to him. He had all the statistics, not interested. Our agendas, our traditions are so strong. It's never changed, you know. It's never changed. I remember something like 35 years ago when I was a young consultant at Flinders Medical Centre, going to a conference in Tasmania where a man got up and talked about peptic ulcer being produced by a bug, this tiny little organism. What's its name, Bruce? Helicobacter pylori. Yeah, I saw it. Well, and I saw several elderly, senior, important gastroenterologists stand up in the meeting and say, "You trying to tell me, I've been treating peptic ulcer for 40-something years, you trying to tell me it's an infection? Pull the other leg," it whistles. They were actually quite rude to this guy who was a proper scientist. Well, of course, a couple of years ago, he got the Nobel Prize because he was right. He fulfilled Koch's postulates, which is the way you prove scientifically about cause and effect and not just an association. Took a long time, took that long for his very obviously correct science to be recognised. Well, that's when I'm alive. Well, Semmelweis had a bad time. He got excluded from his hospital in Vienna. He went back to his own country where he applied the same statistics in his own hospital where women were dying, and they wouldn't believe him either. It was something like 40 years before they started to understand sepsis. So it's a common story, but you see, 3,000 years before science, if they obeyed the instructions that God gave them, they avoided these diseases. And circumcision was a sign of the covenant with Abraham. So again, a religious law, but the Mayo Clinic reported in the mid-1900s of a series of 568 consecutive cases of cervical cancer in women admitted, and not one was a Jewish woman, but 7% of their client base were Jews. There's a very strongly suggestive factor there. And at that time, in the general population, cervical cancer constituted 80% of genital cancers in women. So the Jewish law had a good medical consequence for their race. It's just a little sideline of interest. And of course, in our day, rejection of circumcision for cultural, not medical reasons, is only a small factor in the now high incidence of cervical cancer in Western civilization. It's not so much to do with that, but the rejection of the moral law has a huge part to play in the modern disease of cervical cancer. So, you know, the presence of the virus within the cells as a pre-cancerous infection. So you could say that also, therefore, to a large degree in these days, are self-inflicted. Got to be careful using that word, but I'm using it because it's pretty hard to avoid it. Lung cancer. Well, we all know about that. You know, before 1912, and my mother was born in 1912, my father was born in 1907. Before 1912, lung cancer was called the rarest of diseases. But all of my career, it's been one of the commonest causes of death. Why? The cigarette. And I don't need to tell you about that because everyone knows about that. But it became such a common cause of death. And it's been a long, almost impossible battle against the millionaires of the cigarette industry, hasn't it? Step by step, little steps are made, and it's not really had huge impact on the world as a whole. But Australia is well up in the stakes of those who are benefiting from the ceasing of smoking. Heart disease is another. We talked about lifestyle diseases. Well, there you are. Some years ago, there was a major headline in the media over a decision by cardiac surgeons in the UK to give priority in coronary artery bypass grafting to non-smokers over smokers because the results in smokers were so bad. Oh, that caused a stink, didn't it? Because these sort of value judgments not used to being heard from doctors. Obesity, well, there's an example of a modern self-inflicted disease in Western civilization. We'll say no more about that, but it's really partly through ignoring common sense rules of eating and lifestyle. And we could talk about AIDS, but we won't. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, it's a modern disease due to infection with the human immunodeficiency virus, which is mostly spread by sexual activity outside of a stable marriage relationship. Now, there's a lot more to it than that. Of course, it's now become a major killer throughout the world. But there is a sense in which, there was once a politician in our country who said, you don't catch HIV, you have to ask someone to give it to you. boy, did he cop it for saying that. You can imagine how much he did, but there was a truth in it. So you see, there is such a thing as avoidable suffering in that sense. And I think having made that point, we will pass on. And we'll talk about direct judgments. Now, you would know of these before I tell you. I'll give you a few examples. I'm working from the scriptures. In the Old Testament, we have the example that Abraham was told in Genesis 15 that his people would become slaves, but they would be sorely afflicted by their captors, and the judgment on them would be that many of the plagues would come upon them. So that all that happened to Egypt in those days was foretold as a judgment. Sodom and Gomorrah, we don't need to say a lot about that, except to say that there is a modern homosexual lobby that says, yes, but that judgment was about breaking of the law of hospitality. Well, if you read the story, it's screamingly obvious that it wasn't about that. It was about the wickedness of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Miriam, you remember, was struck with leprosy for complaining that Moses was getting an unfair advantage over them. God was favouring him, and she was struck with the leprosy, and Moses intervened on her behalf. So that was an example of a direct judgment. Now, in all these, it was made clear why this was happening. So I don't think people need, as automatically many do, to think that something that happens, which is unfortunate for them, is a direct judgment. And there are many other examples. David's adultery with Bathsheba, you remember? The child, Nathan said, will die. And he fasted and prayed, but it was to no avail. The child died, and David accepted that because he realised that this was a true judgment on his very obvious sin. He accepted that. I love the story of Gehazi, Elisha's servant. You would all know that from 2 Kings 5. I'll just remind you how it goes. Naaman the Syrian had been healed of his leprosy, an unbeliever from another country. Elisha had told him what to do, and he didn't. He sent his servant out to tell him. Somewhat insulting. So Naaman thought, but Naaman was healed because he obeyed. And he offered great reward to Elisha. He said, no, I don't take rewards. I do as I'm told. And so he left. But Gehazi said, the man's loaded. We can't let this opportunity get away. So he sprinted after him and said, oh, there are 2 prophets from the hill country that have come down. I wonder if my Lord would consider giving a talent of silver to each and some festal garments. He said, yeah, delighted. And he unloaded. You know, a talent of silver weighed 34 kilograms. 2 talents of silver and festal garments. Needed 2 servants to carry it all back to Elijah's quarters. He hid it and slid in along the back wall. You can just imagine. And in my mind's eye, I see Elisha was writing or something. He didn't even look up. He said, where have you been, Gehazi? Who, me? Nowhere. You know how sudden lies sound so stupid? It's a great example, isn't it? He said, did I not go with you in spirit? Is this the time to be receiving gifts? God has been gracious to this foreigner, this unbeliever, and you're feeding yourself with his gifts. He said, the leprosy of Naaman the Syrian will cleave to you and your family from now on. And he went out from his presence with leprous as white as snow. Now that's a direct judgment, if you like. Very clear why it happened. We don't have to argue about it. In the New Testament there are fewer examples, but still very dramatic. Ananias and Sapphira, I'll just mention them. And you know what happened to them in Acts 5? Acts 13, Elymas the magician was struck blind for seeking to turn the proconsul away from the gospel that Paul was preaching to him. And Paul said, "You will be blind." He predicted this judgment upon him, and when he happened, he realised what had happened. And Saul's own conversion, in a way, was a form of judgment, if you like, upon his blindness. This brilliant man was totally blind. This is what I say about the truth needs to be revealed. You never get there with IQ, or else this guy with his degree and PhD would have understood. He didn't understand anything of it. And so he was struck with blindness. Sort of a almost metaphor, wasn't it? Because here this brilliant man couldn't really see, and when he was filled with the Spirit, he did. So, and one of the ancient prophets, Isaiah, said, "In the path of your judgments, Lord, we wait for you. For when your judgments in the earth, the inhabitants of the world learn righteousness. If favour is shown to the wicked, he doesn't learn righteousness. In the land of uprightness, he deals perversely and doesn't see the majesty of the Lord." There is a place, not only for the judgments of God, but to see in them the goodness of God as he educates about what is true. Then there's suffering as an attack. What does that mean? Suffering as an attack. You remember Jesus told a parable, and it was about the wheat and the tares. Where did the tares come from? Say the servants. An enemy has done this. So you see, that sort of attack is very directly an attack of the agent of the evil one. God's still in control, you see, so it's not so very different, but his agency comes into play. Jesus talked about a woman whom Satan has bound for 18 years. And while he doesn't talk a lot about that with his healed subjects, there must have been many others who were similarly released when the stronger man bound the strong man. Paul talked about his thorn in the flesh. He said, "A thorn was given me in the flesh." Given by whom? Well, the giver of gifts. The messenger of Satan to buffet me. Strange, isn't it? It was given me to keep me from being too elated, said Paul. So it was as if the evil one taunted him. God gave him the gift, but the evil one taunted him. So isn't it interesting? The evil one seems to be necessary in God's economy. I've always asked myself for most of my life, why would God allow an evil being like Satan in our midst? Tolkien understood something. He read The Lord of the Rings. Remember that, now who was the little hero? I get stuck for words. No, Frodo. Frodo couldn't have achieved the aim of the Fellowship of the Ring to throw that ring into Mount Doom without the evil Gollum. You see? Isn't it intriguing? He understood something. And so because of Gollum, they achieved their mission. Would they ever have achieved it without that evil? You see, there's more in that story than just a good yarn. He understood something. He was a practising Catholic, of course. So he knew something. And so we could give you many other examples, but we won't. We'll simply, we'll just remind you about Job. And Job, of course, I spoke about before. Now, there is something more we want to say. Well, we're running out of time. Well, I'll tell you a story instead. It's better to tell a story because we probably said enough. I want to tell you a story about Paul was his name. A big man, an American, strode into my outpatients one day, 6'7", tall and not fat. He's perfectly proportioned, just big. "What is it, Doc?" he said, and he pointed at his neck where there was a little lump, and I could feel it, a little round pea-like lump. We've got a name for this in medicine. We talk about Virchow's lymph node. It's Toisier's sign, and the sign is of cancer of the stomach. Anyway, he could have got a lymph node from several other causes, so I checked him out and I couldn't find any other obvious causes. He seemed to be fit and well. And I said, "Well, I think it's a lymph gland. It's enlarged. It doesn't hurt you, so there's a fair chance it's something quite serious." Lymph nodes that hurt usually aren't as serious as lymph nodes that don't hurt when they're enlarged, you see. So I said, "We'll find out about this." And I did a fine needle aspiration, which I'd been taught how to do by the Associate Professor of Pathology. And 10 minutes later, he rang with the result. This man was brilliant. He taught the whole of Adelaide how to do this special skill of cytology. He could look at a few cells smeared on a slide, and within minutes he'd tell you what it is. No one else could do that. His name was Professor Arell, and they used to call him One Cell Arell. Very clever, a Swedish doctor, and he taught the city about that. Now, I realised in the meantime that this man, Paul, was an angry man. We'll call him Paul Drake. I can't actually remember his surname. He had had left arm pain and had surgery for the complex thing called a thoracic outlet syndrome. Never mind about that. It didn't work. It was done at the repat. He didn't get any help. Worse than that, he was blacklisted because he was on compo, you see, and all the employers run a mile. And he was very angry, and particularly angry with doctors. So I knew I was batting uphill to... He wasn't going to like me either, because I had a feeling I got bad news. I did. The phone rang. "It's not a lymphoma," he said. "I'm afraid it's adenocarcinoma from upper GI tract." Fancy that. This is from a man with no symptoms. I said, "The news is not good." I said, "It's cancer, and it's not curable because by definition it's already spread." And this was a long time ago. We had very ineffective chemotherapy then. So I said I can shrink it with a few rays, but that's not the point. And I did arrange that. I took him to oncology clinic. They said, "We can't help you." But I thought he should hear that from someone else. What would a surgeon know? I said, "You don't like doctors, you don't like hospitals, stay away. But if you have any problem at all, just ring me. Just come. You won't have to have an appointment. I'll always see you." So, I got to know him. I called once or twice in his home. I used to do that in those days. I had a bit more time. And he was a rebel, but he once had a Catholic faith. It was dormant, you know, had died of disuse, I suppose, as many faiths do. And I got to know his family. This was really after he had come back with a little bit of vomiting, and I'd investigated him and shown that he had cancer of the stomach, as I had guessed. But I said, "Don't have anything done till you have to." Well, he had to, so I did a little bypass, and that was quite minor operation, and out he went. And he stayed away until he needed to come, but that's when I was visiting him, and I got to know his family. His wife had multiple sclerosis. She needed some effective means of support, and I was able to put her in contact with those. His kids were at school, and I got to know them. I chatted about a lot of things. Another thing had happened to him. A friend had told him about a good investment. He had put all his money into it and lost a lot. Some of us have friends like that. We've been talking about that sort of thing tonight. I said, "You know, your money in America, you have in God we trust on it." "Oh," he said, they don't all trust him now." I thought, that's interesting. And soon we were agreeing that God is good and God is just. How about that? In an angry man who everything had gone wrong for. And once or twice I prayed for him, and he liked that. And then I didn't see him for a while, And he turned up one day in outpatients and he was a shadow of his former self. He had lost 5 stone, which sounds a lot, but if you're 14 stone, you can lose 5. But he looked thinner and he looked dehydrated. And I said, you probably need rehydrating. We'll pop you in and give you a few litres of saline and you can go home when you're feeling better. And so he came in and I thought, well, we can do this repeatedly if need be for a while. I had a new registrar, an American. He called himself a brash New Yorker from the Bronx, and it was about right. I introduced him this day on the ward round to Paul Drake. And I said what had happened to him and introduced him. And Paul suddenly looked at me and said, "Am I dying, Doc?" And I thought, And I saw Don look at me, the registrar, and they're full of psychology and lots of modern teaching that I didn't know much about. Unknowing, Don didn't realise I'd never done any psychology or any psychiatry for that matter. And he was thinking how I was going to break this news. But not having done it, I thought the best psychology was the truth. So I said, yes, Paul, but we don't know when our calendar is in his hands. Isn't that right? And he leaned forward and smiled and shook me by the hand. And away I went to operate till 11:30 that night at another hospital. And then went home to Crafers where it was winter, like now, probably about 2 degrees. Scraped my tea off the plate, because this were the days before microwaves. Went to bed, silence reigned. Seemed like the middle of the night. I was awake, wide awake, not tired. It seemed warm. I wondered why I was awake, and Paul's face came up before me. And I thought, well, pray for him. The ceiling seemed to be open. The sky was open. It was so easy to just lift him up. And I could see him smiling. And it went on for some time. I wasn't sure when, but suddenly the cuckoo called 5 o'clock. And I didn't remember anymore. But next day I did my rounds, did outpatients all morning, and Don came in at the end of it and said, "Do you want to make round?" Yes, we'll do a round. "Oh, by the way, Paul Drake died at 5 o'clock this morning," he said. Why am I telling you the story? Because I don't know what it means. But I think, I have a feeling that God was doing something, and He just involved me in that. Honoured to be involved. I thought something else. I think God was, the Good Shepherd was collecting a stray. I thought I loved Paul Drake, but I don't love him like God did. I realised that my love was very, very thin, very pale thing. See, we love because He first loved us. That's love. Love responds to that which it receives. So there is a story of a man who came into something, and I think came into something more than I know, through what we would say a tragedy, a disaster. I think the day will come, hopefully for all of us, when we can look back with our retrospectoscope and see how some disasters, some forms of suffering were essential for God to do what He had to do. And we will have to recategorise our definition of a tragedy or disaster. It won't answer all the questions. I never promised it, but I was learning more than my patients in some cases, and I think this was a case in point. Now I think we stop there. We'll resume and complete the subject next time. I think it's in a month's time. Is that Ron?
Yeah, first Tuesday in August.
First Tuesday in August. So thank you all for listening. And where, if we can, we might have a little time for some questions on that occasion. I don't know whether you usually have questions here and now. If you do, I think our time's gone.
Yeah, 5 minutes. minutes of questions, be all right.
Well, there you are, a concession, allow a question or two should you have them. I don't promise to be able to answer your questions because I'm not a fount of wisdom. I'm a learner in this. But if you have any, feel free to ask. And if you want to ask them quietly and privately, then afterwards. Thank you all. Might see you again. You hit trouble, you're right there. Well, thank you very much for inviting me back a second time. I was a surgeon until 2 years ago and I never used to get invited back a second time. No one seemed to like a second go. The subject, you might think, is an unusual one, suffering and the mystery of it. And I did comment last time that suffering is something which pretty well no human beings avoid before they die. It is universal in one way or another. And I defined suffering, and it was a list of fairly gloomy things, but all of the dictionaries left out persecution. And to you tonight, the form of suffering you're most likely to know, apart from the problems like arthritis and a few chronic diseases. I mean, acute medicine isn't a problem because of analgesia, pain clinics, and pharmacology. We've got a pharmacologist here tonight. Where would we be without pharmacology? The new civilization of the West is used to that, and we set our course by that, but I'll have more to say about that in a minute. One of the starting points I made was that when we confront that, and when we confront unusual or difficult circumstances, when we have pain in our lives, the starting point for many of us is the goodness of God. If you know that, if you believe in the sovereignty of God, it has a huge comforting effect in the midst of trouble, because you can take that practical view. Well, he knows this may appear terrible, but there must be something within his purposes, because everything is within his purposes, and it just steels you, and it makes a huge difference. To suffer and not understand, have any reason why, as you can see, aggravates, magnifies any form of suffering. So I simply say that, and we'll repeat quickly a recap of the causes of suffering, which I rehearsed fairly quickly, and I talked about some of the common sense statements about the causes of suffering. I'm not sure whether you agreed or not, but I said the greatest suffering was not physical. I actually believe that, particularly today, for the reasons I just gave. Anxiety about suffering is probably worse for many than the actual physical pain, and there are much worse forms of suffering than physical pain. And I said the majority of suffering in the world is man-made, and I have an old friend who said arrogance, ignorance, cupidity and stupidity covers a huge amount of it. That's very good. I thought that was very good, because most of it is human caused. And so I quoted C.S. Lewis, who said that wars, guns, racks, whips, prisons, they're all man-made, and what men do to each other, what humanity does to each other, is a terrible thing. We talked about starvation in the world, but there's enough food in the world, and there's enough, as Gandhi said, for its need but not for its greed. So the distribution of food is our problem, and that's been like it for hundreds and hundreds of years. I may not have mentioned that We've currently been going through an uncomfortable time economically in the world. Everything's been shaking. Well, the cause of a lot of that was probably greed in high places such as Wall Street. And again, it's self-inflicted, or it's human-caused suffering. You would have watched your super falling. You watch the dollar go up and down like a yo-yo. It's quite funny, really. I think it's quite quite amazing that money is like a yo-yo. We talked about avoidable suffering after that. What could I have meant by that? Well, I meant that take one group of people, the Hebrews. There are a huge number of laws that came down to them via Moses in the Torah, which were about, really it was about ritual cleanness and about which foods they should and shouldn't eat and what they should do. And many of them are common sense health laws, we can say retrospectively, 3,500 years later, but it had nothing to do with health. It was what God required of them. But we can say retrospectively they were wonderful health laws. So to obey the law was to avoid much suffering. That's what I meant by avoidable suffering. And then the next topic was direct judgments, and that's much rarer, but the scriptures are full of examples where various forms of suffering came upon various people, and it was usually because of something they did. And to reassure you, virtually in every case an explanation is given. The scriptures make it clear. God told people what was going on, or his servants did, such as the servant of Gehazi. He was greedy. Gehazi was greedy for the gold of Naaman the Syrian, you remember? And he slipped out and said his master changed his mind. He wanted to receive some of these festal garments and a big load of silver, and Naaman was very happy to give it to him. But he incurred the wrath of his master, and the leprosy of Naaman the Syrian landed upon him, and it was a judgment. And that was pointed out to him. In the New Testament we have things like Elymas, the magician, who was trying to skew the teaching of Paul to the proconsul, Paulus, I think his name was. And Paul looked at him and said, "You son of the devil," or words to that effect. You're always trying to skew the crooked thing, make crooked the things of God which are straight. You will be blind. And it was a judgment of God, and he became blind and needed someone to lead him around. So that's a direct judgment. And of course there are a number of such occasions in the New Testament. And the fourth category was suffering as an attack. And I mentioned a number of situations, and Jesus told a parable once, and you remember that the wheat had been sowed, and when they came along later there were weeds coming up in the wheat, and Jesus and the master said, "An enemy has done this." So it raises the question of a specific attack. It's not as common, but once again we are told in the scriptures when that is the case. And of course the classic example of that is Job. And we mentioned Job briefly, but we won't stop on that because there's a lot more ground to cover. Job was an example of endurance and faithfulness to God in the face of terrible suffering, because he didn't know about the encounter which occurred beforehand in which the enemy was permitted to attack him. He didn't know that. I wonder what the story would have been like if he did. But I think that we may know that we have a confidence in God even more greatly. We have reason to have than Job did. And yet that man was remarkably faithful, and he did not curse God as his wife suggested, and he kept being faithful to him. So there are many of the things we could have mentioned, we did mention, and I'll just mention them again as a start. Now I want to quote someone who most of you wouldn't have heard of. His name is Professor Peter Kreeft. He's Professor of Philosophy in Boston College, and he's a practicing Christian, and he's a great author, and I have enjoyed reading. I'll tell you a little bit what Kreeft says about suffering. He writes, and he wrote a book, Making Sense Out of Suffering, which I greatly enjoyed. He got it, I think, for $2 on a second-hand stall. And since then, I've always been looking for something he's written. He writes for everyone who has ever wept and wondered. Who does that include? Well, it should be all human beings. We presume that animals neither weep nor wonder. It's one of the great distinctions in the animal kingdom, if we put ourselves in there. And he gives a short account of religious positions which are easily answered, but they are positions held widely across the world today, and they are obviously denials of the truth as we have learned it. He says this: suffering so often involves family relationships and those closest to us, and I'm sure many of you, and the older you are, the more you will agree with that. He said people hurt less physically now than ever before, largely to the things I mentioned: anaesthetics, analgesics, cures for more diseases. He says, think of a world without anaesthetics. When was the last time you felt the equivalent of a sword through your arm? That was common once. Yet people are hurting more psychologically and spiritually today than ever before in this lonely crowd. Suicides are up, he says. Depression is up. Mindless violence is up. Boredom is up. The word boredom, he says, doesn't exist in any pre-modern language. It's a modern word. It's only been invented in the last few hundred years. Never existed before that. Isn't that interesting? Think about that. Loneliness is up. Drug escapism is up, he says. Why? He says, because the barbarians are no longer at the gates. What are we escaping from? Why can't we stand being alone with ourselves? Solitude, he says, the thing which ancient sages longed for as the greatest gift, is the very thing we give to our most desperate criminals as a punishment. Why have we destroyed silence in our lives? Well, you know how it is. If a young man in an old car enters the end of the street, you feel him before you hear him. All the buildings vibrate as he goes past. That's what a ghetto blaster is, I presume. And he says modern man doesn't have the answer to the question of why. Our society is the first one that simply doesn't give us any answer to the problem of suffering except 1,000 means of avoiding it. And I think that's a very acute observation. And he then lets the secret out that a lot of believers get very angry with God sometimes. He said that's especially well kept secret among evangelicals and fundamentalists. Because he sees the same sort of moral problems in the churches outside it. And they might have a better track record, he says, on things like drug addiction, murder and suicide. But there are as many gluttons, gossips, adulterers, child abusers and misers within as without. What a sad fact. And he says, as for the two worst sins of all, pride and hypocrisy, we set the world's record. It's not a good thing to be said about the church. He's talking about the organisation, of course, of the church. And he points out that the scriptures are very clear in pointing out how human beings are, and it's all there, warts and all. Chesterton said there's only one unanswerable argument against Christianity: Christians. And he showed who he was thinking of, first of all, when he wrote the following letter to the Times, that is that great newspaper in England at the time, and they had asked for some essays on the topic, what's wrong with the world? And he wrote, Dear Sirs, I am, full stop, sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton. And those older members of you will realise how clever that is, because that was the way you ended a letter in those days. I am, comma, yours sincerely, and the name. So his statement differed by the tail of a comma from the normal answering of a letter, but it meant something entirely different. And it was a very good, short, two-word essay, really, if the Times editors could take that in. And being a philosopher, he was widely read, and I won't stop on the philosophers tonight. I'm not really well read in them, but he talked about fairy tales, which is not philosophy. It's one of the things which we grew up with. And he used to say things like, good stories need monsters and mystery. Now, you'll remember the stories you used to read, and some of those you still read to your children. They also involve risk from great danger, low chance of success, and a fair bit going wrong. Tolkien, of course, who was a great storyteller, believes that eucastrophe is the highest function of a fairy tale. What's eucastrophe? Eu means good. Castrophe means to invert. So, good inversion. What on earth is he talking about? Not just light, but light coming out of darkness. Joy coming out of pain. And you see, that's really what we are talking about in the subject of suffering. I didn't mention a word last week, but I should have. It's a theological word. Many of you will have heard of it. It's theodicy. What's theodicy? Well, it's a theological word made up from theos, God, and dike, justice. And a man called Leibniz wrote a book in, I think, 1710. Theodicy is the vindication of the justice of God in ordaining or permitting natural and moral evil. But he made a stronger case than that. He said he attempted to prove not just the righteousness of God with evil present, but that it is the best possible world, the world we live in, and the existence of evil is a necessary condition of the existence of the greatest moral good. Now, how would you go proving that? That's what he attempted to prove. In other words, he justifies the presence of things which are so criticised in the world. Well, would God allow it if it wasn't good? That's a simple view of theodicy, and I reckon it's a pretty good one. We'll press on, and I want to talk about an important subject tonight, and the subject is death. Why talk about death? Well, it is, I suppose, the end of many people's suffering. It is always a threat to those who suffer seriously, but it is the end of suffering to many who suffer seriously. And it's always around, you know, it's always hovering in the background, you might say. And it adds its threat to whatever suffering is going on. It's often used as a weapon, isn't it? Ecclesiastes says, no man has power to retain the spirit or authority over the day of death. And of course, in our day, Dr. Philip Nitschke is trying to change this. People are demanding the right to die. They never talk about their right to be born. They talk about their right to die. We are very keen to control everything. And there are many quotes about death. Here's a good one. All human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey. Or a shorter one by a man called Montgomery. What fear of death is like the fear beyond it? And there's a sting in the tail of that short statement, isn't there? It raises a very important question. The Dean of Westminster Cathedral at one stage was a man called John Donne, and I'm sure you've heard of him. He's a great writer, a great poet, the 17th century. He wrote this about the natural man. As he faced death, to him death was a bloody conflict and no victory at last, a tempestuous sea and no harbour at last, a slippery height and no footing, a desperate fall and no bottom. Now that's horrifying writing, very pictorial, picturesque, but horrifying. And of course you remember what St. Paul said about it. Let's quote him, 1 Corinthians 15. Towards the end he said, "Then comes the end when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father after destroying every rule and every authority and every power. For he must reign till he has put all his enemies under his feet." The last enemy to be destroyed is death. And that's how many people would see it. And the writer to Hebrews said this in Hebrews 2, "Since the children share in the flesh and blood, he himself, that is Christ, partook of the same nature, that through death he might destroy him who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong bondage." And that confirms what many people have observed, that all people instinctively fear death. And Montgomery's quote, "What people fear beyond death," is interesting comment. Epicurus was one of the philosophers, and you will know that he's probably the man responsible for the thinking that when going gets tough, eat, drink and be merry. For tomorrow we die. If you had nothing good to look forward to, it's not such a silly thing to do, attitude to take. But he didn't really have a final answer for the question of suffering. You see, he said, what men fear is not that death is annihilation, but that it is not. In other words, people fear that because there is something just somewhere in the system, there is an accounting system. We can't get away from them. Any form of business, you can't get away from accounting. And you even go beyond that. You then have to have auditors to check and to double check. And I think people have a deep, unconscious maybe, awareness that there is a justice system somewhere, and if so, then there has to be accounting. And so the question of the second death arises, which we don't talk a lot about. Forsyth, who was a great theologian, said, "That will only satisfy the conscience of man that first satisfies the conscience of God." Now that's a remarkable statement. I'll say it again. That will only satisfy the conscience of man that first satisfies the conscience of God. That's what it is to be made in the image of God. We actually have a very high standard, even the one we set ourselves. And I believe that human beings fear death. I've seen it in myriads of faces over 45 years of medicine, the fear of death. When someone says, "Is it serious, doc?" that's code. That's code for, "Could it kill me?" People don't say that. They don't like to voice the words. And I'm sure some of you I've told before, but many years ago, a certain Mrs. M came into my surgery bearing an X-ray, which is a common way of presentation among surgeons, probably got even commoner these days. They do more than that. They turn up with 4 or 5 pages off the internet these days, which used to horrify me. But I put up her X-rays. It was a barium meal, and it showed a classical cancer of the stomach. So I told her simply but directly what it was. And she looked at me and she uttered those classic words, "Why me?" Which is a fascinating question. Her face was tragic. I could never forget it. And then she started to tell me all the things she had done all her life, and I got very, very uncomfortable. I couldn't answer a question. And I wasn't about to justify her. I couldn't do that. You see, it's a fascinating question. I've thought a lot about it since. It's a confession and it's a theological statement. Can you see that? because I think what was contained in those words were these following thoughts. This event didn't just happen. There's a plan and purpose in the cosmos. Nothing happened by accident. Someone is in control. And that one has chosen this thing for me, or at least let it happen, which is the same thing. As well as that, I don't like it and I don't agree with the choice. And finally, I'm lodging a protest. All of that in 2 words. At least that's the way I read it. And because of the fear of death, human beings have thought up many coping mechanisms to cope with it because of its threat. First is avoidance, and we do everything we can to avoid death, and that's pretty sensible, like avoiding pain. We are fairly good at getting around problems of pain. So we go for accurate diagnoses and have the very, very best treatment available to overcome the threat of death from our illness. We want everything done. People explore every possible means of avoiding death from illness. And that's, of course, good. It has pushed science along. Language. We change language. You know how many people, when they get a serious diagnosis of a malignancy, say, I'm going to fight it. Now that's sport psychology language. It works in sport. I've never been too sure that it works in medicine. But that's what people say. And when I used to tell people about a diagnosis, they would often feign not hearing or not understanding. And I'd tell someone later that the doctor didn't tell me. So I quickly learned to have a relative present. That has another benefit. It stops the games, and it stops this thing which relatives had a habit of doing from time to time. You mustn't tell Aunt Agatha that she'd got cancer. It would kill her. And what they meant is, I don't want to have to face Aunt Agatha and discuss death. I don't want to answer her questions, so don't you tell her. It was them they were protecting, not Aunt Agatha, you see. So I got wise to that. And there's a lot of wishful thinking and there's a lot of denial in that, I'm sure you recognise. Euphemisms are common in denoting death. So for many now, we don't die, we depart, or pass on, or pass away. Sounds nicer. Or go before. Some strange words are used. Fall asleep. And of course we don't speak of a corpse. We talk of the departed or the loved one. And the coffin has become a casket. What did caskets used to hold? Treasure. See, it's nicer, really a nicer way of thinking, isn't it? And amongst the escapisms, the funeral industry has been busy. In some places, the dead body has been made up with a full cosmetic facial. Now, some of you are probably aware of that. They've been dressed up. In some funeral parlours, they actually dress the dead person up and arrange them in a casual attitude. In some places, they'll even be holding a cigarette holder with a smouldering cigarette, as in fixed social poise of the living. Now, this is an attempt to tame death. I don't think it works very well, but it's amazing what people get up to. And there are 2 worldwide industries that have grown up, multi-billion-dollar industries that have grown up around man's attempt to escape ageing and its conclusion. The first is the world of cosmetics. I'm sure you'll agree. It's big. And the second is the modern health industry. That's big. That is an embarrassing percentage of every modern government's agenda, their budget. It always embarrasses them. I remember talking to the then Premier of our state, and he was saying our health budget is 25% of the budget. We're not sure what to do about it. We've got to get it down. His chances of getting it down was not good. So cosmetics. I won't say much about it. It used to be skin deep. It's gone a lot deeper than that now. You know, you can have hair removal, you can have hair replacement, you can have various forms of irradiation, Botox, collagen, complex, expensive things. I did a operation on a hernia on a man probably at about 38, 40 years of age, one simple hernia. And I did it on a Monday, and he came back on the Friday to have his stitches out. And when he came back, his face was covered in plaster and he had 2 black eyes. I said, "What happened to you?" He said, "I had a facelift." And I said, "You didn't need a facelift?" He said, "Oh, that's what my mother said." And he said, I'd like to ask about the gap. And I said, "Oh, I think it's about $40. And he laughed. I said, "Okay, you tell me, how much did your facelift cost?" And he said, $22,000 in cash up front for a procedure done under local. The cosmetic industry is big. It's alive and well. And I don't put that in the category of orthodox surgery. The health system, well, we all know about that. It's huge, and we could classify it as orthodox and non-orthodox, unorthodox. And you know about the orthodox system. You've got a doctor or two amongst you. So that includes diagnosis, treatment, the use of medical science, and that involves counselling, psychology, psychiatry, palliative care, and every other medical service that is part of our training and our practice, and each branch is constantly growing. The unorthodox, or less orthodox, include alternative medicines and treatments. You've all heard of Ian Gawler and his meditation and lifestyle treatments. Nothing silly about any of it. The Simonton group therapy, which majored on imagination. You imagine your white cells and your immune system fighting the disease, and they believe you get great help by that. There are crackpots and they're incredible claims. I mean, I used to think of cosmetic surgery and their ideas meant to stop ageing, etc., were only exceeded by the incredible claims of the advertising used in selling the ideas and the naivety of those who believe them. And I think we see that every day around us. But there has been a great attack on death, and we need to spend some time on that, because really that is the kernel of our Christian faith. Luther said this: "Adam, if he had not sinned, would have lived a corporeal life which would have grown, increased and generated until God would have translated him to that spiritual life in which he would have lived without natural animal body." Paul says it, I think, even clearer. He said in the Roman letter, "Therefore as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all men sinned. Death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam." One of the early church fathers, Irenaeus, he suggested that death was introduced by God to put an end to sin, since man ceases to sin only after he dies, which I thought was rather funny, but of course it's true. And Professor Kreeft has a wonderful metaphor, which I think is probably taken from the early church fathers. He says, "Death is the tourniquet that staunches the bleeding of sin." Now think about that one. Death is the tourniquet that staunches the bleeding of sin. C.S. Lewis called death a severe mercy. A mercy to the person who died. You wouldn't want to go on getting older and older and older and wind down. And also to the community in which the person lives. That requires a bit of thought, really, doesn't it? So, something happened about death. And I'll say a bit more about that after I give you a couple of quotes. I will say something about what Christ did, but a summary was given to us by Lewis, who says this: the New Testament writers speak as if Christ's achievement in rising from the dead was the first event of its kind in the whole history of the universe. He is the first fruits, or the pioneer of life. He has forced open a door that has been locked since the death of the first man. He has met, fought and beaten the king of death. Everything is different because he has done so. This is the beginning of a new creation. A new chapter in cosmic history has opened. And I then want to quote again our friend Mr. Kreeft, because he says this about what Christ did. Before I do that, I will actually tell you how I've been helped in thinking about what Christ did for us. The cross, of course, is the symbol, if you like, the universal symbol of undeserved suffering. It's the event really by which everything else in history is seen in its true perspective. Because here we see the extent of evil of the human heart, and not only the human heart, but of the other powers. And here is the ultimate revelation of the depth of the love of God for his world. This is the ultimate answer to the question of theodicy. How do you justify, how do you vindicate God in the presence of evil? Well, the cross, which is the best demonstration of the power of evil, is also the best vindication of the justice, the wisdom, the goodness, and the power of God. I don't know how you would try and summarise what you see happening in the crucifixion. I don't think it's ever possible to fully understand it. If we ask people to stand up in church and just say, tell us what Christ did when he suffered on the cross, I think most members of a church would battle to summarise it. I would. But there are a lot of pictures that come out of Hebrew history and their prophets, and these pictures together point to some of the things that happened in that time. And I've just written down a list of some of these things which I got out of my head. I didn't get them from any book. They're metaphors for the most part, but they were real things. Sacrifice, for instance, that was something common to the Hebrews, and not only the Hebrews, but other peoples in history. And an animal usually gave up its life for human sin. There was the Passover. That was a special sacrifice, a particular one, of course, in which the blood of the animal put on the lintel and the side posts of the door meant that the angel of death passed over, and that last terrible plague didn't strike that house. There's the high priest. What did he do? Well, he offered sacrifice annually to atone for the sins of Israel. Well, we can see a high priest activity in what Jesus did. There's a prophet like Moses, and Moses spoke of him. He will be raised up from among you. You must listen to him. You must do what he says. He was talking about Jesus. How do we know? Well, Peter quoted that comment from Moses in Exodus after he had healed the man at Gate Beautiful. He quoted that and said, this is the one that Moses was talking about. There's the scapegoat. Do you remember? The priest would lay his hands on the head of the goat, and the sins would be liturgically transferred to the goat, and he'd wander off into the wilderness and be lost, presumably die, carrying the sins of the people. There was the bronze serpent. Jesus talked about that before his death, remember? As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that he might thereby draw all men to himself. The bronze serpent was the answer given to Moses for the rebellious people who were bitten by snakes, and if they looked to the bronze serpent they could be healed. You can see in the cross what Jesus was talking about. There was Messiah, that is the Christ, the anointed one who would be the Saviour and bring in the golden age. There was the suffering servant that they didn't necessarily associate with Messiah or with God, but, as Isaiah pointed out, he would suffer vicariously for the sins of the people. There's the Redeemer. A Redeemer was a kinsman who got someone off the hook by paying their fine or paying them out of trouble, dealing them out of trouble. Well, we see a kinsman who said he was our brother in the cross. There's the Good Shepherd. Jesus told the people that he was the Good Shepherd and that he would save his sheep and lay down his life for them. There was the King, and particularly the King of David's line, who would have an everlasting kingdom, closely associated with Messiah. There's the bread of heaven. Now that was talking about manna, but of course Jesus applied that word to himself. I'm the true bread from heaven that comes down and gives life to the world. And there are many others, but all of them come together, if you like, and help you see what was happening in that event. It's almost as if they were facets of a diamond. And you see this diamond and you start to see the beauty of the whole thing. At least I've found help from that. Even though these are analogies and they're incomplete, I think they help us. Now, I want to give a quote at this point from Kreeft, because he shows us the paradoxes that occur about in the cross. I think he writes well. He says the incarnation was the biggest shock in history. Even his own people, whom he had prepared for 2,000 years for the event, couldn't digest it. He came to his own, you remember, John says, and his own received him not. Even his own disciples couldn't understand him, really. It was the unthinkable, what Kierkegaard calls the absolute paradox, and listen to this, that the eternal God should have a beginning in time, that the maker of Mary's womb should be made in Mary's womb, that the first one became second, the independent one became dependent as a little babe, dependent for his very earthly existence, not on the will of the flesh, John tells us in his first chapter, but on the new Eve saying yes to the angel, where the old Eve had said yes to the devil. That's a different way of putting it. You see, even the devil didn't expect this folly, says Kreeft, that God should step right into Satan's trap, Satan's world, the jaws of death on the cross, that he should give Satan the opportunity to cherish forever in dark, satanic glee the terrible words from God to God. My God, why have you forsaken me? This was unimaginable, that God should take alienation away from man by inserting alienation into the very heart of God. That he should conquer evil by allowing its supreme, unthinkable triumph. Deicide. The introduction of death into the life of God, the God of life. That he should destroy the power of evil by allowing it to destroy him. And this is what Kreeft calls, this is an example of the foolishness of God, which is wiser than men, and the weakness of God that's stronger than men. I think they're great paradoxes to draw our attention to. He talks about the great battle where the little lamb, the Arnion, defeats the great and terrible beast, Therion, in the last battle, the heavyweight championship of the universe, by shedding his own blood. And so Satan's bloody plan becomes the mean of his own despoiling and of his own defeat. I think that was good writing. He says also, we needed a surgeon. He came and reached into our wounds with his bloody hands. He didn't give us a placebo or pill or good advice. He gave us himself. And then I'll give you a couple of quotes. Time's gone, and then we'll stop. and they come from the Word of God. We could have a year of studies of the Word of God on the subject of suffering. I'll just give you a couple. For instance, from the Psalms. Psalm 119, "Before I was afflicted I went astray, but now I keep your word." And a bit later, "It's good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes." And you see how he is supporting the argument we're making about suffering. David wrote many of the Psalms which cry out to God. Psalm 6, "Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I'm languishing. Heal me, for my bones are troubled. My soul is sorely troubled, but thou, O Lord, how long? Turn, O Lord, save my life. Deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love." Or Isaiah 48, "Behold, I've refined you, but not like silver. I've tried you in the furnace of affliction. For my own sake I do it. For how should my name be profaned? My glory I'll not give to another." Alfred Lord Tennyson picks this theme up, and he writes in one of his poems about iron dug from the earth, heated hot with burning fears, and dipped in baths of hissing tears, and battered with the shocks of doom to shape and use. He's talking about a process. I think it's the process of maturing in the Christian life. Lamentation says, "For the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he doesn't willingly afflict or grieve the sons of man." Well, if he doesn't willingly do it, does he unwillingly do it? Does he do it because it's essential? And knowing God as we do, I would say that's the case. But in all their affliction, he was afflicted. Mysterious words, aren't they? But they're worth considering, and I think we'll have a break now before we proceed. Afterwards, I want to complete comments about suffering as such, and then I want to say something about heaven and hell. Why? Well, heaven is seen as the total cessation of suffering for those who believe in God, and hell is regarded by many as eternal suffering. So we can't really speak of the subject without mentioning. But to buoy ourselves up for that, I think we better have a cup of coffee and a break. Thank you. Well, we'll continue the subject of suffering with a few quotes from the scriptures. I gave you a number from the Old Testament, and you can see how they pointed to the fact that the Old Testament writers acknowledged that suffering is something which was used for good in the hands of God. I think I started on the first night saying that politicians vow to abolish it. That's how much they understand. And young people think it's a scandal. But you see, when you get older, you realise that it's much more subtle. And I've already made the comment that somehow or another, it's because of the nature of the world as it is, and the way God intends it to be, somewhere in that is the explanation of why suffering exists, I believe. I want to now bring you a few quotes from the New Testament. Now, Jesus never wrote a book. There's someone who's written a book telling why Jesus never wrote a book. It's as if he trusted his hearers to tell the story correctly. Would you have? knowing human beings? Would you have trusted them to still tell the story correctly? Fancy trusting the water of life, as we call it, to be safely delivered through rusty pipes. So it's an amazing thing, and there appeared to be no plan B. I think he trusted the Holy Spirit more than we do. Now, some of his statements about suffering were fairly straight. You remember in the beginning of the Beatitudes, he finishes off saying, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely," better be false, "on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so men persecuted the prophets who were before you." You would be in good company, he said. We might refer also to the temptation sins and his treatment, but we won't spend long on them. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. And this is metaphorical. If your hand offends you, cut it off. Now, what an amazing thing to say. It was metaphorical. He didn't mean self-harm. He meant you must be radical with the sort of temptations that could end you up in hell. And he spoke about hell more than anyone else in the New Testament. But he said more than that, while you're being persecuted, love your enemies. Now that is an incredible standard, isn't it? It's not the standard the world accepts. He said, reported by John, "If the world hates you, you know that it's hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of it, therefore the world hates you. Remember that I have told you, a servant isn't greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also." So he was giving a warning about the rest of history. And those words have not completed their importance, have they? I think we live in days when our lucky country may be disturbed like it hasn't been in the past 200 or so years. I'm sure you can sense that. There are gospels which are preached which say, if you come to Jesus, all your problems will be solved. It's a false gospel. It's a false gospel. In fact, some of your problems will just start because there is an opposition that people don't see, and it's very real. And as for suffering, Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. Actually, the word tribulation is used in the older versions. But he said, be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. And the word is taken from a Roman threshing implement called a tribulum. Do you know what a tribulum is? It's a long stick with a little leather thong and then a little lump of wood on the end of that. And they used to use it for bashing the grain to knock the wheat out of it. So a loose translation could be, in this world you will be thumped. And it was in the nature of a promise from the one you might have expected to be the kindest of all. And of course, no one suffered more than he did, which we have referred to. The apostles understood it not when he told them, but later, when the Holy Spirit opened their understanding to all that he had been doing and all that needed to be done and all that he actually achieved. And without the Holy Spirit, they wouldn't have understood that. And of course, they then set about preaching about Christ at the expense of their own comfort and eventually, in all cases but one, their own lives. And if that's true, why should we expect a smooth ride? So I'm not going to spend any more time on that because, as I said, many studies could be written on this. But I'll attempt to make a couple of conclusions to the subject, and then I'll mention heaven and hell. I think we should dispose of some wrong ideas, and perhaps we have. And that's one of them. If you're a Christian, God will see that you don't suffer. And I would say no, he offers cleansing, forgiveness, justification, and heaven, but not a removal of affliction. That was never in the promises. In fact, he promised the reverse. Secondly, we hear people say, we can understand why another person suffers. They name a person, why they suffer. No, we can't understand. Remember Job. If we think we can make a judgment because someone's suffering, we'll almost certainly be wrong. And thirdly, you hear people say, and we have thought, we know what is good or bad, necessary or unnecessary. And I would say, no, we don't. We get it wrong. We get it wrong because we look from a limited human perspective, us who see through a mirror dimly, and we don't see the full story. And I've already given the simplest answer, the simplest case for theodicy. If it weren't necessary and good, God wouldn't have allowed it. So there must be some important reason behind suffering. Some wise sayings have come to us from older, matured saints, both named and unnamed. We're about to name a special saint in Australia. Well, there are thousands of unnamed saints, if you use the New Testament terminology, that is, believers in Christ. Teresa of Avila said, "From heaven, even the most miserable human life will seem like one night in an inconvenient hotel." I think that was a very good statement. And I think she also said, "This world makes a lousy home but a good gymnasium." Now, living in the era of gymnasiums, you know what I'm talking about. On one occasion, I performed a very big operation on a man of 85 years of age. He had a carcinoma of the esophagus. That's a serious diagnosis. And the operation involved removing the whole of the esophagus as it passes through the thorax, and mobilising the stomach and bringing the fundus of the stomach, that's the upper rounded end, bringing it right up through the chest into the neck and anastomosing it to the gullet in the neck. And I used to do that operation without opening the chest in old people. That way you lost less blood, it was less traumatic to them. But I knew this was no small undertaking in this man, so I said, "You could die, you may not survive this operation." "Doctor," he said, "my son runs a church, there's several hundred people. There are hundreds of people praying for me, and doctor, they're praying for you too." And he said, "What's more, if I die, I go to be with the Lord. What's wrong with that? And if I survive, I'll be happy." And I thought, with odds like that, why am I worried? I thought that was a very, very good attitude. He survived the operation, and I learned something from a wise patient. I've had a lot of people who've told me they're praying, used to pray for me, and I appreciated that enormously, because there are so many things we don't understand, and one is how much is going on in something like a simple operation. There's more going on than you know. Have I heard someone say that? It's got to be true, and it's more true than we know. And the apostles expected trouble, and they lived their lives in an understanding of what could happen to them, because they had an understanding of what was going to happen and what was being held for them. And that's got to be our attitude. Now, I want to speak for a little while on the subject of heaven and hell, and I told you why. It's because many regard those as really the end, the conclusion of the matter. It's not often that you hear about them. In fact, mostly when they're talked about, they're used as jokes. Is that not right? Do you hear a lot of people talk about hell or heaven seriously? It's not the done thing, is it? People talk about them as destinations. Well, I don't think that's really right. Why should we talk about them? Because Jesus did. Had a lot to say. In the Sermon on the Mount alone, he mentions hell 5 times and heaven 17 times. They were important to him, that's a good enough reason. But if you want another reason, it's because we have free will. What do I mean? If you've got free will, you've got freedom to choose. If you can choose God's gift of cleansing, forgiveness and new life, you can also reject it. So says Peter Kreeft, scratch free will and you will find hell. Otherwise, the words free will have no meaning. All right? So place is probably not appropriate word to use for heaven and hell. Heaven's not so much a place as a life. We get a lot of help from the Greek. Zoe is real life, true life, eternal life, the highest of life. Bios is simply a natural life, as we see in the world. Hell is more a state of mind. Lewis says this, the saved go to a place prepared for them where Jesus is. You remember he said, where I am you may be also. That's heaven. Where is it? Who cares? It's where Jesus is. And he knows what's going on. The damned go to a place never meant for men at all, says Lewis. To enter heaven is to become more human than you ever succeeded in being on earth. To enter hell is to be banished from humanity. What is cast or cast itself into hell is not man, it is remains. And we know not with not sort of consciousness. All that has some bearing on the questions people ask and the criticisms they make about hell. So many moderns scorn talking about such things. They say their scientific training renders them incapable of believing in such things. Well, that's a cop-out. Science couldn't know anything about either. Science is a very crude tool, really, for measuring things. And once you get beyond the things you can see and feel and measure physically, you get almost into the world of philosophy, so you can't prove things in the same way. One thing is certain, we're all going to die, so to ignore death is really very lazy. It is, as I say, a cop-out. So the question of hell and heaven needs to be considered. There is a cynical retort thrown at Christians, pie in the sky by and by when you die. It may have even been a part of a song. I didn't know the song. But it's a loaded statement. It's either there's pie in the sky or there isn't. And if there isn't, Christianity is false. We are living a delusion. And you remember what Paul said about that delusion? If that's the case, we are all people most to be pitied. I'm not even sure that that's true, because if it's a delusion, it's a magnificent delusion. In some respects, it's better than reality. Anyway, more about that in a minute. But of course, Paul actually laboured that in 1 Corinthians 15. Christians are often called escapist, and Christianity is escapism. But you see, if it's true, it's not escapism. And those who call it false, they're escapist if by so doing they're avoiding facing the truth. The boot is actually on the other foot. So let's proceed. We'll use the shoulders of some tall-shouldered saints, all right? You see further when you're standing on the shoulders of giants, someone said. So a fair bit here from Kreeft and from Lewis, who've written a lot on this. Now, hell is regarded as part of a detestable doctrine by many, and we might agree with that. But what we think about it matters not one iota if hell exists. So let's look at one or two of the arguments that are put. One is retributive judgment. Retributive punishment is not moral, it's vindictive. It's not worthy of God. But you see, we're talking about objective justice, not subjective vindictiveness. And we're talking about necessary results. We use law in our own society and we regard it as essential. Well, why may not the same thing be true in the spiritual realm? Some criticise Christian belief because it believes in hell, and they say it's barbarous, it impugns the goodness of God. How could a loving God, they say, condemn a person permanently? Probably there are some belief systems that wouldn't have any trouble with that. You see, Allah does as he wills. His will is implacable. No questions may be asked and no correspondence will be entered into. He says it, that's it. No question of praying to him about a change of mind. But you see, we have this problem of theodicy because the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ is good and he was good. And so why these terrible things that happen? And I think the answer must lie somewhere in our dim and partial understanding of the nature of human sin and the huge personal cost it was to deal with it. We don't get it, you see. We think God fusses over little things. A part of the objection turns on the disproportion, apparently, between eternal damnation and a transitory sin. Should there be a second chance, people say? And Lewis believes that if 1,000,000 chances would fix it, you would get 1,000,000 chances. Kreeft asks the question, why this disproportion, by another question. How can one little slip of the foot on a cliff merit the whole loss of someone's life? But it happens, doesn't it? How does a momentary taking your eye off the road have such a terrible consequence? It happens. So you see, we're dealing with facts. Someone has said the frightful intensity of the pains of hell, surely that is a terrible thing. And it's similar to what we've been saying. But Kreeft says, yes, they're terrible. They're terrible. Jesus talked about it, but that's not an objection. It's just a true observation. The observation only becomes an objection if it's assumed that what's so horrible cannot exist, says Kreeft. But horrible things do exist. Insane delight in cruelty exists. The Holocaust existed. Thereby, the objection seems to have no power. And we'll finish... the second to last comment about hell is, surely no charitable person could be blessed in heaven while conscious of even one human soul in hell, says a very kind person. Kreeft answers, how could God let evil eternally blackmail the joy of heaven? Are we more merciful than God, he asks. Anyway, let's look at the nature of the torment and the pains of hell. And I think this is good, and you've probably heard this before. Isn't God love? Says Kreeft, though the damned do not love God, he loves them, and this is their torture. The very fires of hell are made of the love of God coming to people who only want to hate and fight, thwart his will, and therefore his love becomes torture. If God would stop loving the damned, hell would cease to be torture. Now, isn't that an interesting view? I've heard that put before by one Geoffrey Bingham, those two didn't read each other's literature. Says Kreeft, if the sun could stop shining, lovers of the dark would be no longer tortured by it. I think that's a good analogy. It's comforting to those who are a bit soft-hearted to even think of what Jesus calls very serious. Kreeft says this, we need to be hard-headed and soft-hearted, not hard-hearted and soft in the head. I reckon that's good. And Lewis says the damned are in one sense successful rebels to the end. The doors of hell are locked on the inside. They don't even will the first preliminary stage of that self-abandonment through which alone they can enter eternal life. They enjoy forever, enjoy inverted commas, the horrible freedom, also in commas, they have demanded, and therefore they're self-enslaved. Just as the blessed forever submitted to obedience, and they become through all eternity more and more free. So there is something very important there. And Kreeft says the great divide is not really between heaven and hell, not between, well it is, it's a great divide, but it's not between the finders and non-finders, it's between the seekers and the non-seekers. And Jesus said, if you seek, you will find. Now what a sweeping statement. But he said it, so I repeat it. Now heaven is seen as the final answer to all suffering, the end of all suffering, and so it's appropriate to spend some time on this in conclusion. Paul said, I reckon the sufferings of this present time aren't worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us, is actually the correct translation. And then he speaks of the creation and the way it's groaning and longing for the sons of God to be revealed. Very, very wonderful. Lewis says there may be times we don't desire heaven, but he wonders more often whether in our heart of hearts we've ever desired anything else. So he looks to what Kreeft looked to, and Kreeft wrote a book, Heaven, the Heart's Deepest Longing, and he says, no, people mightn't express it, but there is something almost too deep to express there. It's what we are made for. Our soul has a curious shape, he maintains, because it's made of specifically to fit a contour of the divine substance, or a key to unlock one of the doors of the house with many rooms. Salvation is particular for every person. We were made for it. Made for it stitch by stitch, as a glove is made for a hand. And it's a beautiful personal view of salvation. Now, we won't look at the scriptural statements about heaven, because I want to spend a few minutes looking at clues about heaven from the scripture and from various saints. You all know the verses, and we've quoted some already. Lewis talks about shadowlands. Where is shadowlands? It's here. It's the earth we live in. Which is like a shadow of the real. And if you've read The Last Battle, story of Narnia, you'll understand what he's talking about. Where does he get the idea from? Well, I found a quote. Have you heard it? What if earth be but the shadow of heaven, and things therein each to other like, more than on earth be thought? Milton, Paradise Lost. I'm sure Lewis would have read Milton because he read everything classical, and I think Shadowlands may come from there. We'll still be human. We won't be angels. One of my consultant friends said she expected to be peeping over a cloud and to flit from cloud to cloud. I don't know, perhaps so. I don't think we'll feel like anyone else. We'll feel like us, but we'll actually be different. Will be unrestrained. What Paul calls the body of death will be taken away. We'll be more childlike. We have to be to get there. You remember Jesus said, unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. We still could talk about that, but I don't think we have time. We'll have bodies. You knew that, didn't you? You're not going to float around like a spook. We'll not be disembodied spirits. We'll be recognisable. I think we'll be souls that have bodies rather than the other way round. Remember the resurrected body of Jesus? He had a body. You realise it still had his wounds. They weren't healed. What does that mean? And he said, I have flesh and bones. Feel me and see. Handle me and see. A spirit hasn't flesh and bones as you see I have. He ate fish in front of them. Did he need fish? I don't know. I think he was attempting to reassure them. At least that's part of it. But you see, they didn't recognise him. Those on the road to Emmaus walked and talked with Jesus for hours and didn't recognise him. And we are told their eyes were holden that they couldn't. So there was a supernatural thing there. When did they recognise him? When he did a characteristic act. Suddenly they knew who this was. His body could appear amongst them through locked doors. I wonder, is this what St. Thomas Aquinas called agility? And I wonder if this is what happened to Philip. You remember he preached to the Ethiopian? And after he'd preached and baptised him, the Spirit of God caught Philip away and he was seen no more. And he was found at Azotus. I've never heard anyone comment on that. How did he get there? Was this agility? You know, a dewdrop miracle, sign of the coming summer? Don't know. But of course the new body will be a marvellous gift to those who've suffered in their earthly body. Some of you know of Johnny Erickson, the quadriplegic, who writes beautifully and has assisted many people in their faith. She's looking forward to dancing. We have a man in our church who has no arms. They were ripped off in a farming accident when he was 2. What would it be like for him to fling his arms around his loved ones? And some patients suffer with severe arthritis or strokes or cerebral palsy. Kreeft likens such as those, they'll be like balloons held underwater. They will leap up in great joy. We'll understand what we didn't understand before. Now, I don't think we'll know everything, but we are told as in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. We'll know as we are known. Think what that could mean. And certain words will have no meaning. They'll disappear. What sort of words? Well, no one's going to be needed. Manipulation will disappear. There'll be no religion, only reality. There'll be no theological societies, I believe, only truth. What are the words that will disappear? Ambition, famous, distinguished, superior, inferior, racism, hatred, prejudice, locks at locksmiths, security officer, police, soldier, doctor, nurse, pain, crying, death. The vocabulary is going to be smaller, isn't it? But perhaps the understanding bigger. I think there'll be tears of joy. We could say something about possessions. Paul says we have nothing but possess everything. And there'll be something like that. Actually, communism had an attempt somewhere along its passage to achieve something in which there was joint ownership of things. Didn't work. I don't think they understood human nature well enough, really. And if they did, what you can do about it. But there will be they had something real there. They just couldn't get their utopia. So as far as possessions, in heaven we will not possess beauty, truth and love, because these are aspects of God himself and will be in him. So we'll be in them, okay, rather than them in us. Time. We're running out. Kreeft speaks about time, and he uses again the Greek words chronos, time which passes, ticks away. There'll be none of that in heaven. There'll be kairos time, lived time. All that we think of, savour, understand, enjoy, use profitably, such as in loving or serving. None of that will ever be lost. Such things are timeless, as indeed is the cross of Christ. He says chronos is the first temporal dimension, like a line. Kairos is the second temporal dimension, like a surface. Only that, of course, won't be limited. And eternity is the third temporal dimension, like a solid. And he says eternity is the entity which includes all the others. It's the concrete reality of which the others are only abstract aspects. That's very interesting thinking. But we won't stop there. It just gives you a bit of a kick along. Oh, he says, by the way, when people face their death, they often claim that their life events pass before their eyes in a fraction of a second. Well, he says, this is the beginning of eternity type thinking. It's all there at the same time. I don't know whether that's ever happened to you, presumably not because you're all here. But you might have thought you were close, and I think I've experienced something like that. I've been electrocuted 3 times, but here I am. Music. Is there music in heaven?
Yep.
Is there heaven in music? Have you ever been transported by music? See, this is very much Kreeft's thinking, and it's a universal, ageless language. That's something remarkable about music. Music sends a sign, a promise of what we will know. Says God to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know." Bit ironic. "On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" So the world was born in joyful singing with music. In Zephaniah, we are told, "He will rejoice over you with gladness, he'll renew you in his love, he'll rejoice over you with loud singing." So God sings loudly. Finally, joy. A very important clue. Lewis calls joy the serious business of heaven. And it's not merely a human feeling, as I think you know. It's a God thing. See, happiness depends on what haps. Joy doesn't. You can have joy when the circumstances are adverse. So Paul's locked up in a Philippian jail. It was probably freezing cold. He was probably hungry. He was chained. What was he doing? Singing, praying to God, praising God. And the prisoners were all listening. You can be sure they heard what this man was saying. He had joy in the midst of that. Jesus told a parable in which the master said to the servant, "Enter into the joy of your Lord." So you see, it was God's joy. And joy is a part of God, and when joy is present, God is present. So it's one of the fruit of the Spirit, which shows that it's God's, not ours, and it's present when God indwells. So I want to finish this little bit with a quote from Peter Kreeft about joy. "Christ is the God who has come, and he is joy. Our God is also Jove, Jupiter, the God of joy. He is all the gods and more, not less." You see, these people were striving to understand God when such things were suggested, and probably not getting there. He's certainly not less jovial than Jove. Joy bubbles and brims at the heart of God, the heart of reality. God is an overflowing fountain of joy, a volcanic explosion of joy, a trillion burning suns of joy. A joy that will utterly break our hearts if we touched even a drop of it at its source. He is the joy that does break our hearts with love and longing whenever we catch a taste of it in human love, or see the shadows of it in the beauties of nature, or hear the remote echoes of it in great music. Even here in the valley of the shadow of death, that is our life, we are overcome by its traces. And he finishes quoting Lewis, which he does all the time. Not bad for a Catholic philosopher. I think that's a sign of his understanding of the truth. He quotes a man who has great skill in writing the truth, as he does himself. And Lewis says this: "The faint, far-off results of these energies which God's creative rapture implanted in matter when he made the worlds are what we now call physical pleasures, and even thus filtered. They are too much for our present management. What would it be to taste at the fountainhead that stream of which even these lower reaches prove so intoxicating? Yet that, I believe, is what lies before us. The whole man is to drink joy from the fountain of joy. And that's a quote from The Weight of Glory, which is one of Lewis's marvellous essays. I seem to remember Baxter Kruger saying, it's the greatest essay he's ever read. I recommend it to you. We've nearly finished. I'll finish with a story because my life has been full of examples of people who've taught me things. This one was Jill. Jill was a young woman, I would say, lower 40s. That's young.
Very young.
And she was brilliant. She was a lecturer in a TAFE. She was the daughter of probably the senior radiologist of our city. She was married to a business tycoon. She was wealthy. She had an acre of garden and she loved it. 3 children. Life was complete. She was brought along by her father and introduced, having had a colonoscopy for seeing blood, and multiple tumours were found throughout her colon. 2 of them were malignant, the others were benign. There was only one treatment available to remove the whole colon. All the lining of the bowel had to go. It was unstable. It was changing to tumour. So we did that. She took it very well. She held a wake for her colon and invited all the nurses along. She was quite a character. And I saw her regularly and follow up. She was magnificent, really. In the midst of all this, she started getting symptoms and her blood screen showed that she had raised liver enzymes. A liver scan, because that's all we had in those days, was not the CT, showed secondaries in the liver, and therefore she had a time limit. Her husband left. He was too busy, really, to cope with a wife who wasn't well. Seen that lots of times. And she started having chemotherapy. In the midst of that, she suddenly came to Christ. I asked her how it happened and she couldn't really tell me, but she just couldn't avoid him. You know, all my life I've heard formulae of how you become a Christian. Don't believe it. There is no formula. Christ comes to us and saves us. There are a million ways he can communicate with human beings. And we had wonderful fellowship. We would always share when she came along. I gave her a chemo in those days. I used to do that in the early days. And we had good fellowship. I used to pray with her. I stopped charging her after a while because we had such good fellowship. And how does Medicare cover prayer as the only treatment? I wasn't sure, so I thought I won't risk it. We just had fellowship. And she became jaundiced at one stage. It was obvious that she was losing ground. I remember her coming in, I said, how are you going? And she gave me a weak smile. And jaundiced people never look well. Have you ever noticed that? And she said, wonderful. Every day is like a new adventure. Now, how about that? She grew like a mushroom. She read so many things. She took it all in. She matured fast. And when she became week, we were exchanging books all the time. I put her in a hospice, and there I used to visit her, and we continued the fellowship. And she was filled with peace and joy. And after she died, the family brought her books back, and they say, we'd never seen her so content, so much in peace, and in such joy as before she died. You see, that to me is the answer to theodicy. Why does God let some of these terrible things happen? We call them terrible, and as I said last time, we categorise things as disasters or tragedies. But one day, with the retrospectoscope, which is a very accurate instrument, we will see that we need to recategorise, and what seemed to be a tragedy was probably essential, and God knew that. And in his hands, all things work together for good. Just let's pray as we finish. Father, we thank you that you are sovereign and Lord of all things. You are also the loving Father, and you order all things according to the counsel of your will. And you have a goal in this world, and you have a goal and purpose for each of us, and you have a fulfillment for us which we can be content to leave in your hands and let your processing take its place. So grant us wisdom to know and believe and trust you, and have your way in us, your will be done in us, that we might learn wisdom and become mature in Christ. For we pray in his name. Amen. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share those things.